The wind cut sharp across the wooded ridge in 1878 when Thomas Mitchell learned his first winter that building exactly what every homesteader said to build could still leave you freezing. He had raised his cabin like every settler in the territory was told. Tight log walls, central stone fireplace, vertical chimney drawing smoke straight up, standard and trusted. By January, he was burning 3 cords of wood each month and still woke to frost on his interior walls. Across the ridge country, other homesteaders fought the same losing battle in cabins built by the book but failing by the season. Neighbors mocked when Mitchell began digging what they called his foolish ditch chimney behind a hillside dugout. His buried flue system kept that shelter 50 degrees warmer than outside temperatures while using half the wood of a standard cabin. What did he understand about heat moving through earth that every serious builder today ought to know? The problem started in December when the northwest wind found every gap Mitchell had thought he'd sealed. His cabin sat exposed on the ridge like every other homesteader's, following the standard wisdom that flat ground meant easier building and better drainage. But as snow piled against his north wall, the wind drove cold air through chinks he'd packed with mud and moss just weeks before. The logs had shrunk in the dry winter air, opening new gaps that no amount of clay could permanently fill. Mitchell had learned building from the men who'd helped raise his walls that September. They'd taught him the accepted method: fell straight pines, hew them square, notch and stack them tight, then seal the gaps with whatever clay or mud they could scrape from the creek bed. The fireplace went dead center of the main room with a stone chimney rising straight through the roof, the way every cabin in the territory was built, the way their fathers had built them back in Ohio and Pennsylvania. But Mitchell carried memories that other homesteaders didn't. He'd spent 2 seasons as a young man working timber claims in Wisconsin, where he'd met Scandinavian immigrants who talked about the sod houses they'd built on the prairie. Old Eric Larson had described digging into hillsides when lumber ran scarce, covering roofs with earth that stayed warm all winter. Mitchell had dismissed it then as foreign strangeness, but now, watching his carefully stacked cordwood disappear while his family shivered under wool blankets, those conversations returned with new weight. The real crisis came during the January cold snap that lasted 11 days. Outside temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and Mitchell's fireplace became a monster that devoured wood faster than he could split it. He'd calculated he had enough cordwood to last the winter, 4 cords cut and stacked in October, but by late January, he'd already burned through more than half. Worse, the heat rose straight up the chimney and out, leaving the floor and lower walls cold enough that water buckets froze overnight 3 feet from the hearth. His neighbor Jacob Brennan stopped by one bitter morning and found Mitchell splitting wood in pre-dawn darkness. Brennan's own cabin suffered the same problems, but he'd resigned himself to the pattern. Rise before dawn, split kindling, restart the fire, tend it constantly until bedtime, then shiver through the night until morning. "That's just winter," Brennan said, watching Mitchell's breath steam in the frigid air. "A man burns wood to stay warm. Always been that way." But Mitchell had been studying his hillside, noting how the snow melted differently on the south-facing slope, how the earth stayed unfrozen deeper down where he'd dug his root cellar. The cellar stayed at a steady 40 degrees, even when the cabin dropped near freezing overnight. The ground itself seemed to hold warmth that his wooden walls couldn't capture. The idea came gradually, pieced together from half-remembered conversations and careful observation. If the earth could store coolness in summer and warmth in winter, if old Eric's sod houses had worked for immigrants on the treeless prairie, then maybe the standard cabin wasn't the only answer. Maybe it wasn't even the best answer. Mitchell began his experiment tentatively that February, digging into the slope behind his cabin during the few warm afternoons when the ground softened. His neighbors noticed immediately. Sarah Brennan asked her husband why Mitchell was playing in the dirt like a child, and word spread quickly among the scattered homesteads. When Mitchell borrowed Brennan's shovel and pickaxe, explaining he wanted to try building a dugout for next winter's wood storage, Brennan shook his head. "Thomas, you've got cabin fever. Spring will set you right." But Mitchell wasn't building a woodshed. He was excavating a living space 8 feet into the hillside, wide enough for a family, deep enough that earth would surround 3 walls and rise over part of the roof. The work was backbreaking, frozen clay mixed with stones that dulled his tools. But as he dug, he began to understand something about heat that his cabin building neighbors had never considered. The earth 6 feet down stayed at that steady 40 degrees, immune to the temperature swings that tortured his log walls. Still, Mitchell faced a problem that nearly stopped his experiment before it began. A dugout might stay warmer than a cabin, but how could he heat it without filling it with smoke? A traditional fireplace and chimney wouldn't work in a partially underground space. The chimney would have to rise from below ground level, creating draft problems and structural complications he couldn't solve. Then he remembered something else Eric Larson had mentioned, something about running smoke through channels under the floor, heating the ground itself before the smoke escaped outside. Mitchell had thought it sounded impossible then, but now, standing in his excavated space with winter wind howling overhead, the idea took on new urgency. The earth could be more than insulation. It could become the heating system itself. Mitchell's first decision revealed knowledge that separated him from every other homesteader on the ridge. He chose his site not for convenience, but for the sun. While his neighbors had built on the flattest ground they could clear, Mitchell positioned his dugout on the south-facing slope, where the winter sun would strike the entrance directly during the short daylight hours. The slope itself became part of his design, providing a natural earth berm on the north side that would block the prevailing winter winds. He excavated his living space 15 feet wide by 20 feet deep, cutting into the hillside at a depth that put the floor 6 feet below the original ground level on the uphill side, but only 2 feet below grade, where the slope dropped away to the south. This created what the Scandinavian immigrants called a house in the hill, 3 walls surrounded by earth, 1 wall open to capture light and solar warmth during the brief winter days. The excavation itself taught Mitchell about soil layers that cabin builders never considered. 3 feet down, he hit clay mixed with small stones that packed hard when wet but cracked when it dried. Below that lay a denser clay that stayed moist year-round, and deeper still, sandy soil that drained well but held its shape. He learned to work with these layers, using the hard-packing clay for the floor and the sandy soil for drainage around the perimeter. For the roof structure, Mitchell cut pine logs into 16-foot lengths, laying them across the excavated space from the back earthen wall to a front wall built of stones chinked with clay. But instead of leaving the roof exposed like a cabin roof, he covered the logs with a layer of bark, then 6 inches of the clay soil he'd excavated, and finally a top layer of sod cut from the hillside. This roof covering weighed nearly 3 times what a wooden cabin roof weighed, but it created something no cabin possessed, a massive thermal barrier that would absorb heat during the day and radiate it slowly through the night. The most critical element was the earth berm Mitchell built against the north wall. He piled excavated soil and stones 4 feet high against the back of his dugout, extending the berm 6 feet beyond each end wall to create windbreaks. This earthen wall intercepted the northwest wind that drove winter cold into every cabin on the ridge, deflecting it over the roof instead of through the living space. When March brought the first warm days, Mitchell began testing his theory. He burned identical fires in both his cabin and his nearly completed dugout, measuring the results with a thermometer he'd ordered from the general store in town. In the cabin, a fire that warmed the air to 70 degrees by evening dropped to 35 degrees by dawn, only 5 degrees warmer than outside. In the dugout, the same fire size produced 65 degrees by evening, and by dawn the temperature had only fallen to 50 degrees. The difference lay in thermal mass, a principle that cabin builders ignored entirely. Wood walls and a wooden roof absorbed almost no heat during the day and released what little they'd captured within hours after the fire died. But Mitchell's earth-covered roof, clay floor, and soil-backed walls absorbed heat slowly all day and continued releasing it through the night. The earth acted like a giant storage battery for warmth. Mitchell discovered this effect worked in reverse during hot summer days. When outside temperatures climbed into the 90s, his cabin became an oven that trapped heat under its wooden roof and held it long into the night. The dugout stayed cool, its earth envelope moderating the temperature swings that made wooden buildings uncomfortable year-round. Testing continued through the spring as Mitchell refined his technique. He noticed that morning frost formed on exposed ground all around his site, but never appeared on the earth covering his dugout roof. The soil surface there stayed 10 to 15 degrees warmer than surrounding ground, revealing how much heat the earth mass stored and released. Word of Mitchell's experiments reached Erik Larsen, the old Scandinavian who lived 8 miles south near the creek bottom. Larsen visited in April and spent an hour examining the construction, nodding approvingly at details that confused other neighbors. He explained to Mitchell that his own father had built similar shelters in Minnesota during the harsh winters of the 1860s, when immigrant families survived temperatures that killed livestock and broke the spirits of men living in hasty wooden shanties. Larsen shared techniques Mitchell hadn't considered: how to grade the soil berm so spring rain would run off without eroding the walls, how to select sod with root systems that would bind the roof covering and prevent washouts, how to pack the earth layers for maximum insulation without creating spaces where cold air could penetrate. By late April, Mitchell's fuel consumption tests showed remarkable results. During a week of cold spring weather that dropped nighttime temperatures into the 20s, his dugout required only 1/4 the firewood his cabin would have needed for equivalent warmth. The earth envelope had transformed a basic shelter into an efficient heating system that captured, stored, and slowly released thermal energy. Jacob Brennan visited during the testing period and found Mitchell's family comfortable inside the dugout, while similar weather left the Brennan cabin cold and drafty. Sarah Brennan remarked that the dugout felt steady warm rather than the alternating hot and cold cycles they experienced in their cabin. But Brennan remained skeptical, arguing that digging into hillsides required too much labor for uncertain benefits. Mitchell's success with thermal mass and earth sheltering solved the first half of his heating challenge, but he still faced the critical problem of smoke removal and heat distribution that would make or break his entire system. The breakthrough came when Mitchell realized his earth envelope could do more than store heat; it could distribute it. While his neighbors built fireplaces that sent hot exhaust straight up and out through vertical chimneys, Mitchell began designing a system that would capture that escaping heat and channel it through the earth mass itself before releasing it outside. His inspiration came from Erik Larsen's description of heated sleeping platforms used by Chinese immigrants in mining camps, where hot smoke from cooking fires traveled through channels under raised beds before exiting through distant vents. But Mitchell adapted this principle for his hillside dugout, planning to run exhaust horizontally through the earth berm behind his living space rather than vertically through a traditional chimney. The construction began with precise excavation. Mitchell dug a tunnel 18 inches wide and 20 inches tall, starting from the firebox location inside his dugout and extending 22 feet uphill through the earth berm to exit 8 feet above and behind his shelter. The tunnel rose at a grade of 3 inches for every foot of length, creating enough upward slope to maintain natural draft while keeping the flue buried under at least 2 feet of earth along its entire path. Lining the tunnel required flat stones that Mitchell gathered from the creek bed and quarried from exposed ledges on his property. He selected pieces roughly 12 to 18 inches long and 3 to 4 inches thick, rejecting any stones with cracks that might split from repeated heating and cooling. The tunnel floor received a careful layer of these flat stones, fitted tightly together and packed with clay mortar to create a smooth, sealed surface for hot gases to flow across. The tunnel walls and roof demanded even more precision. Mitchell built them using the same flat stones, creating an arch-like structure that could support the weight of earth above while maintaining an airtight passage for smoke and heated air. Each stone was fitted and mortared with clay mixed with chopped grass for binding strength. Where stones didn't fit perfectly, he chiseled them to shape using a hammer and cold chisel borrowed from the blacksmith in town. Testing the draft proved more challenging than Mitchell had anticipated. His first attempts produced only weak airflow, with smoke backing into the dugout instead of drawing through the tunnel. He discovered that the tunnel needed not just upward slope but also proper sizing, too narrow, and it would restrict flow, too wide, and the hot gases would cool before reaching the exit, killing the draft entirely. Mitchell solved the draft problem by adjusting both the inlet and outlet dimensions. He narrowed the DEC firebox opening to concentrate the initial heat and increase velocity, then gradually widened the tunnel as it progressed uphill, allowing the hot gases to expand while maintaining flow. At the exit point, he built a small stone chimney just 18 inches tall, enough to prevent downdrafts on windy days, but not so tall as to create excessive draw that would pull heat too quickly through the system. The critical innovation was Mitchell's approach to heat extraction. Rather than simply moving smoke through the tunnel and out, he designed the system to transfer maximum thermal energy to the surrounding earth. He covered the stone-lined tunnel with a layer of smaller rocks and gravel, then packed 2 feet of clay-rich soil above that. This created a heat exchanger where hot gases warmed the stones, which warmed the gravel, which warmed the clay, which slowly radiated heat into the entire earth mass. Initial tests revealed problems Mitchell had to solve through trial and adjustment. The first fires produced uneven heating, with the earth near the firebox becoming too hot, while the area near the exit stayed cool. Mitchell corrected this by installing 2 bypass chambers along the tunnel-length, stone-lined spaces where hot gases could slow down and distribute their heat more evenly before continuing toward the exit. Smoke leakage presented another challenge. Despite careful mortaring, some joints between stones allowed smoke to seep into the surrounding soil, creating the acrid smell that neighbors had warned would make the system unlivable. Mitchell sealed these leaks by applying a coating of clay mixed with ash from his fires, creating a smooth, airtight interior surface that directed all exhaust cleanly through the tunnel to the outside exit. The completed system transformed how heat moved through Mitchell's shelter. When he burned a modest fire for 2 hours each evening, hot exhaust entered the tunnel at temperatures above 300 degrees and traveled slowly through the stone-lined passage, warming the surrounding earth mass. The stones absorbed heat during the fire and continued radiating it long after the flames died, maintaining the tunnel temperature above 100 degrees for 6 to 8 hours after each firing. This extended heating cycle proved far more efficient than any cabin fireplace. Instead of heat rising immediately up a chimney and disappearing, Mitchell's system captured that thermal energy and stored it in the earth mass, which released it gradually throughout the night. The effect was dramatic. His shelter maintained comfortable temperatures from a single evening fire, while neighboring cabins required constant feeding of their fireplaces to achieve similar warmth. Jacob Brennan visited during Mitchell's first week of testing the completed system and expressed the skepticism most neighbors felt. "Thomas, you're going to suffocate yourself with that contraption," he warned, examining the low exit chimney with obvious doubt. "Smoke needs to rise straight up to draw proper. Everyone knows that." But Mitchell's measurements proved the system worked exactly as designed. Using his thermometer, he recorded interior temperatures that stayed between 58 and 65 degrees throughout the night after a single 2-hour fire, while outdoor temperatures dropped into the 20s. His fuel consumption dropped to less than 1 cord per month compared to the 2 to 3 cords neighboring cabins burned during similar weather. The social resistance intensified as word spread about Mitchell's unusual heating method. Sarah Brennan told other wives that digging tunnels in the ground like a badger was no way for a Christian family to live, and several men openly predicted that Mitchell's family would die from smoke poisoning before spring arrived. Yet Mitchell's system continued functioning flawlessly through the late spring testing period, providing consistent heat distribution that made his earth-sheltered home not just warmer, but more comfortable than any conventional dwelling on the ridge. Mitchell's first major crisis came not from cold, but from water. The spring thaw of 1879 brought weeks of steady rain that soaked into his earth berm and began seeping through the clay floor of his dugout. What had seemed like a solid foundation in winter turned into a muddy mess that threatened to undermine his entire heating system. Water pooled around the firebox entrance and began penetrating the stone joints of his buried flue, creating steam that mixed with smoke and made the tunnel nearly impassable for hot gases. The problem revealed a critical flaw in earth-sheltered construction that cabin builders never faced. While wooden structures sat above ground level and shed water naturally, Mitchell's dugout collected groundwater from uphill drainage and spring runoff that had nowhere to go once it reached the excavated floor. Even worse, the earth berm that provided such excellent insulation also acted like a dam, trapping water against the back wall where it slowly seeped through the packed clay. Eric Larson arrived in early April to help Mitchell solve the drainage crisis before it destroyed months of work. The old Scandinavian had seen similar problems in Minnesota dugouts and knew the solution required understanding water flow patterns that most frontier builders ignored completely. Together, they began retrofitting Mitchell's shelter with a drainage system based on principles Larson had learned from Norwegian stone masons. The first step involved excavating a French drain around the perimeter of the dugout floor. Mitchell and Larson dug trenches 18 inches deep along the base of each earthen wall, filling them with graduated layers of stone. Large stones went on the bottom, followed by medium gravel, then fine gravel near the surface. This created a subsurface channel that intercepted groundwater before it could reach the living space and directed it downhill to a drainage outlet below the shelter. But drainage alone wouldn't solve the ventilation problems that Mitchell discovered during his first extended use of the heating system. The combination of earth envelope and buried flue created an almost airtight living space that trapped not just heat, but also moisture from cooking and breathing. Without fresh air circulation, condensation formed on the stone walls and created conditions that could lead to mold or unhealthy air quality during extended winter occupancy. Mitchell's solution drew on principles he'd observed in root cellars and ice houses, structures that needed controlled airflow to function properly. He cut 2 ventilation channels through his front stone wall, a low intake opening near the floor level and a high exhaust opening near the roof line. The intake drew fresh air from outside, while the exhaust allowed stale air to escape, creating a natural circulation pattern that worked with his heating system rather than against it. The intake vent required careful engineering to avoid disrupting the heat distribution from his buried flue. Mitchell positioned it on the south wall where incoming air would be warmed by winter sun before entering the living space. He covered the opening with a hinged wooden flap that could be adjusted to control airflow depending on weather conditions and heating needs. During fires, the intake provided oxygen for clean combustion while preventing backdraft problems in the buried tunnel. The exhaust vent posed different challenges. Mitchell installed it high on the front wall, where warm, humid air naturally accumulated, but he had to prevent it from creating excessive draft that would pull heat too quickly through his earth warming system. His solution was a damper system made from thin stone slabs that could partially close the opening during cold weather, while still allowing moisture and stale air to escape. Testing the ventilation system through the summer months revealed unexpected benefits. While neighboring cabins became stifling during hot weather, Mitchell's dugout maintained comfortable temperatures because the controlled airflow worked with the earth envelope to create natural cooling. Cool air entered through the low intake, circulated through the living space, and exited through the high vent, creating a gentle breeze effect that made the shelter comfortable even on 90-degree days. The maintenance requirements of Mitchell's system became clear during his first full year of operation. Unlike cabin owners who simply chopped firewood and swept chimneys, Mitchell had to develop a seasonal routine that kept his earth-integrated systems functioning properly. Spring meant checking the drainage channels for blockages and adding fresh gravel where winter frost had displaced stones. Summer required inspecting the buried flue tunnel for any settlement or damage, and remortaring joints where thermal expansion had created gaps. Fall preparations involved the most complex maintenance tasks. Mitchell had to clear leaves and debris from drainage outlets, check that the earth berm hadn't eroded during summer storms, and test the complete heating system before winter demanded full performance. This meant burning test fires to ensure proper draft through the tunnel, checking that all stone joints remained sealed, and verifying that the ventilation system balanced fresh air needs with heat retention. The maintenance work proved less demanding than skeptics predicted. Mitchell found that his system required about 12 hours of upkeep each season, comparable to the time cabin owners spent cutting and splitting the extra cordwood his system saved. More importantly, the maintenance taught him to read his shelter's performance like an experienced sailor reads wind and weather, adjusting ventilation and heating based on subtle signs that less experienced builders would miss. Winter testing during the 1879 to 1880 cold season validated both Mitchell's drainage solutions and his ventilation design. Despite weeks of freezing rain followed by deep snow, his shelter remained dry inside while the controlled airflow prevented the stuffiness that plagued tightly sealed cabins. His family reported no respiratory problems or excessive humidity, and the interior air quality remained fresh even during extended periods when they couldn't open doors due to severe weather. Jacob Brennan visited during a February blizzard and found Mitchell's family comfortable and healthy, while his own cabin suffered from condensation problems and stale air that made sleeping difficult. The contrast forced Brennan to reconsider his earlier dismissal of earth-sheltered construction, though he still questioned whether the maintenance requirements made Mitchell's system practical for average homesteaders. By spring of 1880, Mitchell had refined his integrated system of earth envelope, buried flue heating, drainage, and controlled ventilation into a functioning whole that addressed every major challenge of frontier shelter construction. His success attracted attention from other settlers who were beginning to understand that conventional cabin building might not be the only path to comfortable frontier living. The ultimate test arrived in February of 1881 when a blizzard locked the ridge country in sub-zero cold for 17 consecutive days. Outside temperatures dropped to 25 degrees below zero, with winds that drove snow horizontally and made travel between homesteads impossible. This was the kind of winter that broke unprepared settlers and sent families fleeing back east, the brutal season that separated successful frontier techniques from deadly failures. While Mitchell's family remained comfortable in their earth-sheltered home, the conventional cabins across the ridge fought a losing battle against the cold. Jacob Brennan's family burned through 6 cords of wood in those 17 days, rising every 2 hours through the night to stoke their fire, yet still woke to ice forming on their water bucket. Their cabin's interior temperature swung from 70 degrees near the fireplace to below freezing in the corners, creating drafts that made sleep difficult and daily tasks exhausting. The Henderson family 3 miles north suffered worse conditions. Their hastily built cabin had loose chinking that allowed wind-driven snow to accumulate inside, forming drifts against the interior walls that didn't melt even with a roaring fire. Martha Henderson developed a persistent cough from breathing smoke that backed down their chimney during the worst wind gusts, and their 2 youngest children showed early signs of frostbite on their fingers and toes despite staying indoors. Mitchell's performance measurements during this period revealed the full extent of his system's advantages. His shelter maintained interior temperatures between 55 and 68 degrees throughout the storm, requiring only 1 evening fire every 2 days. The earth mass stored so much thermal energy that even after 48 hours without burning wood, his family remained comfortable while outdoor temperatures stayed near zero. His total fuel consumption during the entire 17-day period equaled what neighboring cabins burned in 3 days. More significantly, the health outcomes demonstrated benefits that went beyond mere comfort. While other families suffered from respiratory problems caused by smoky interiors, inconsistent heating, and poor air quality, Mitchell's controlled ventilation system maintained fresh air circulation without heat loss. His family reported no illness during the storm, no smoke-related breathing problems, and no cold-related injuries. They slept through the nights without interruption and maintained normal daily routines while their neighbors struggled with exhaustion from constant fire tending. The extreme weather also revealed structural advantages that Mitchell hadn't fully anticipated. While conventional cabins suffered from log shrinkage that opened new gaps, ice dams that caused roof leaks, and foundation problems from frost heaving, Mitchell's earth-integrated structure remained stable. The thermal mass prevented freeze-thaw cycles in the surrounding soil, eliminating frost damage. The buried flue continued functioning normally because the heated tunnel prevented ice formation that blocked conventional chimneys. Word of Mitchell's success spread through the isolated homesteads when the storm finally broke. Samuel Morrison, who lived 5 miles south, made the difficult journey through deep snow specifically to examine Mitchell's shelter. Morrison found a warm, comfortable home with fresh air and no signs of the smoke, condensation, or cold-related problems plaguing every cabin he knew. The contrast was so dramatic that Morrison asked Mitchell to help him design a similar system for his own property. The social shift that followed marked the beginning of wider acceptance for earth-sheltered construction techniques. Eric Larson reported that 3 immigrant families near the creek bottom had begun excavating hillside sites, adapting Mitchell's drainage and heating principles to their own situations. These early adopters didn't copy his design exactly, but understood the fundamental concepts well enough to create variations suited to different soil conditions and site orientations. Mitchell's willingness to share his knowledge accelerated the spread of earth shelter techniques across the region. Unlike many frontier innovators who guarded their methods as trade secrets, Mitchell welcomed visitors and explained his construction techniques to anyone interested in learning. He helped Samuel Morrison lay out a similar dugout on Morrison's south-facing slope, teaching him to evaluate soil layers, grade drainage channels, and size the buried flue system for efficient heat distribution. By 1882, 7 families within 15 miles had built earth-sheltered homes incorporating elements of Mitchell's design. Each adaptation revealed new applications of the basic principles. The Olson family built a hybrid structure with conventional log walls on the south side for light and windows, but earth-bermed walls on the north and west for wind protection. The Murphy clan created a larger version with 2 separate flue systems serving different areas of an extended dugout that housed 3 generations. Documentation of these techniques began when circuit riding ministers and traveling merchants noted the unusual construction methods in their journals and letters. Reverend William Hayes wrote to his Eastern congregation describing ingenious settlers who have learned to build homes that stay warm in the coldest weather using less wood than a single-room cabin. His detailed observations provided some of the earliest written records of earth shelter construction techniques on the frontier. The long-term validation of Mitchell's approach became clear as the decade progressed. Families using earth-integrated heating systems consistently reported lower fuel costs, better health outcomes, and greater comfort during severe weather. Their shelters required less maintenance than conventional cabins, suffered no chimney fires, and remained structurally sound through seasonal freeze-thaw cycles that damaged wooden buildings. Government land surveyors working through the region in the 1890s documented numerous earth-sheltered homesteads, noting their locations and basic construction features in official township records. These surveys preserved evidence of a building tradition that conventional architectural histories largely overlooked, creating an official record that would prove valuable to later researchers studying frontier construction methods. The technique's influence extended beyond individual homesteads when Mitchell helped establish the first community buildings using earth shelter principles. The schoolhouse built in 1884 incorporated an earth berm on its north wall and a modified heating system based on Mitchell's flue design. The building remained comfortable throughout winter using half the firewood of conventional schools, allowing the district to extend the school year despite limited fuel budgets. Modern archaeological surveys of the Ridge Country have identified foundations and tunnel remains from more than 20 earth-sheltered homesteads built between 1880 and 1890. These physical traces confirm that Mitchell's innovations spread far beyond his immediate neighbors, creating a regional building tradition that persisted until railroad access made conventional lumber affordable for all settlers. The rediscovery of these techniques by 20th century energy efficiency, researchers validated principles that Mitchell had developed through frontier necessity and careful observation. His integration of thermal mass, earth insulation, heat recovery, and controlled ventilation anticipated by decades the passive solar and earth shelter movements that emerged during modern energy crises, proving that practical innovation born from real need often surpasses theoretical design.